My Lai Massacre. On March 16, 1968, American soldiers from Charlie Company entered a small village in Vietnam called Sun Mi, more commonly known as My Lai. The mission was officially described as a search and destroy operation. Intelligence had suggested the area was a stronghold for Viet Cong fighters. The soldiers expected resistance. Instead, they found villagers. Most of the men of fighting age were not even present. The people in the village that morning were largely women, children, and elderly farmers. What followed would become one of the most infamous events of the Vietnam War. Over the course of several hours, soldiers rounded up civilians. Groups of villagers were forced into ditches and shot. Others were killed inside their homes. Women were assaulted. Children were not spared. Some soldiers later testified that no enemy fire had been received. There had been no firefight. Helicopter pilot Hugh Thompson, flying overhead, saw bodies in the village and realized something was wrong. At one point, he landed his helicopter between American troops and fleeing civilians and ordered his gunner to fire on U.S. soldiers if they continued shooting the villagers. By the time the operation ended, between 347 and 504 civilians were dead. Initially, the Army reported a great victory, claiming over 100 enemy combatants had been killed. The truth stayed hidden for more than a year. It was only after a soldier named Ronald Ridenour wrote letters to Congress describing what he had heard that an investigation began. Journalist Seymour Hersh later broke the story publicly. Courts-martial followed. 26 soldiers were charged. Only one, Lieutenant William Calley, was convicted. He was sentenced to life in prison, but the sentence was reduced. In the end, he served about 3.5 years under house arrest. The massacre became a symbol of the moral collapse that critics believed had taken root during the war. Haditha killings. On November 19, 2005, in the Iraqi city of Haditha, a roadside bomb exploded under a U.S. Marine convoy, killing one Marine. What happened next would lead to one of the most controversial incidents of the Iraq War. After the explosion, Marines from Kilo Company moved into nearby houses. Over the next several hours, 24 Iraqi civilians were killed. The dead included women, children, and elderly men. The military's first report stated that the civilians had been killed by the roadside bomb and insurgents, but Iraqi witnesses told a different story. They claimed the Marines had entered homes and opened fire on unarmed residents. A Time magazine investigation in early 2006 brought international attention to the case. Photographs and autopsy reports raised serious questions about the official narrative. The Pentagon launched a criminal investigation. Several Marines were charged with murder and dereliction of duty. One officer was accused of failing to properly investigate the deaths. However, over time, charges were reduced or dismissed. In the end, only one Marine was convicted, and not for murder. He received a reduction in rank and pay, but served no prison time. For many Iraqis, Haditha became a symbol of impunity. For many Americans, it raised uncomfortable questions about the strain of urban warfare and the pressure placed on troops operating in hostile environments. No Gun Rai Massacre. In July 1950, during the early weeks of the Korean War, thousands of South Korean civilians were fleeing south as North Korean forces advanced. Refugee columns crowded roads and bridges. American forces, fearing that enemy soldiers were infiltrating these groups, were ordered to stop civilians from crossing certain lines. Near the village of No Gun Rai, hundreds of refugees gathered under a railway bridge after being told to move off the road. Then, U.S. troops opened fire. According to survivors, the shooting continued for several days. People hiding under the bridge were fired upon repeatedly. Many were women and children. Estimates of the dead vary widely, ranging from around 100 to several hundred. For decades, the incident received little attention outside Korea. In 1999, an Associated Press investigation interviewed survivors and former soldiers, bringing the story to international audiences. In 2001, the U.S. government released the findings of its own investigation. It acknowledged that civilians were killed, but concluded that there had been no deliberate intent to massacre refugees, describing the tragedy as the result of confusion and fear of infiltration. No soldiers were prosecuted. For the survivors, the event became a lasting scar. For historians, it remains one of the earliest and most controversial civilian casualty incidents of the Korean War. In 2003, following the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq, American forces took control of Abu Ghraib prison, a facility west of Baghdad that had once been notorious under Saddam Hussein's regime. What had been a symbol of dictatorship soon became the site of a new scandal. By late 2003, thousands of detainees were being held at the prison. Many had been arrested during raids targeting suspected insurgents. The facility became overcrowded, guards were understaffed, and military police units were tasked not only with security, but also with supporting interrogations. Inside one section of the prison, detainees were subjected to abuse. Prisoners were stripped naked, forced into stress positions, threatened with unmuzzled military dogs, and photographed in degrading poses. Some were beaten, others were deprived of sleep. Several soldiers later claimed they believed they were following intelligence directives. The abuse may have remained hidden if not for the photographs taken by the guards themselves. In early 2004, CBS News broadcast images from inside the prison. The pictures triggered global outrage. Multiple investigations followed. 11 military personnel from the 372nd Military Police Company were ultimately convicted by court-martial for prisoner abuse. Private First Class Lindy England was sentenced to 3 years in prison and a dishonorable discharge. Specialist Sabrina Harmon received 6 months imprisonment and a bad conduct discharge. Another defendant, Ivan Frederick, was sentenced to 8 years in prison and a dishonorable discharge. Specialist Jeremy Sivitz, who photographed many of the images, received a 1-year sentence. Specialist Megan Ambule was convicted of dereliction of duty, demoted, and discharged. No senior commanders faced criminal charges, though some saw reprimands and demotions. In December 1968, during the Vietnam War, U.S. forces launched Operation Speedy Express in the Mekong Delta. The objective was to weaken Viet Cong units operating in the region and disrupt their control of rural territory. The strategy relied heavily on air mobility, artillery, and helicopter gunships. Commanders emphasized aggressive patrols and rapid engagement. Body count became the primary measure of success. Over several months, official reports claimed more than 10,000 enemy combatants had been killed. American casualties remained relatively low. On paper, the operation appeared highly effective, but concerns emerged from within the ranks. Some soldiers later testified that civilians were frequently caught in the crossfire. Helicopter crews described firing on individuals moving through rice fields based on suspicion alone. Villages believed to harbor insurgents were subjected to intense firepower. In a region densely populated by farmers, distinguishing combatants from civilians proved difficult. Former Army officer David Hackworth and others questioned whether body counts had been inflated. Internal Army documents and post-war research suggested that estimates of civilian casualties ranged from several thousand up to 7,000 or more, contrasting sharply with the relatively low number of enemy weapons recovered. Despite these allegations and multiple investigations, no U.S. military personnel were ever prosecuted or convicted for actions taken during Operation Speedy Express. The operation became controversial, both for its human cost and because it highlighted how reliance on body count metrics could shape combat operations in ways that blurred the line between combatant and civilian. On March 12, 2006, in the town of Mahmoudiya, south of Baghdad, a group of U.S. soldiers left their checkpoint and entered the home of an Iraqi family. The area had seen frequent insurgent attacks, and tensions were high among American troops stationed there. Inside the house, the soldiers separated the family members. A 14-year-old girl, Abir Qasim Hamza al-Janabi, was gang-raped. She, along with her parents and younger sister, was then shot and killed. The soldiers attempted to burn the house to conceal the crime. Initially, the killings were reported as part of ongoing insurgent violence. The truth began to surface only after another soldier disclosed details of the incident to military authorities. An investigation followed. By mid-2006, several soldiers were arrested and charged. In subsequent proceedings, multiple convictions were secured. Specialist James P. Barker was sentenced to 90 years in prison after pleading guilty to conspiracy, rape, murder, and related charges. Specialist Paul E. Cortez received a 100-year sentence on similar charges and agreed to testify against others. Private First Class Jesse V. Spielman was convicted and handed a 110-year sentence. Private First Class Brian L. Howard, who testified against others, was sentenced to 27 months in prison and received a dishonorable discharge. One defendant, Stephen Dale Green, had been discharged from the Army before charges were known and was tried in a federal civilian court where he received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He later died in prison in 2014. The Mahmoudiya killings became one of the most disturbing criminal cases involving U.S. personnel during the Iraq War, intensifying debate over discipline, accountability, and the psychological strain placed on troops operating in prolonged counterinsurgency warfare.